Welcome to the overview of Chapter 19 with Mr. Rodman for AP Microeconomics. So today, this is part 1 of a series of 2. I'm going to cover the overviews of Chapter 19 and 20. This video is just for Chapter 19, looking at externalities, and then in the next chapter, in Chapter 20 video, I will look at public and private goods and kind of some odds and ends wrapping up microeconomics. So what are we going to look at in this chapter? We're looking at externalities. We're looking at the Coase theorem. We'll look at negative and positive externalities. We have a graph to go with each of those. And then we'll look at what types of taxes and subsidies are very Pigouvian in nature, encouraging people to do something or not do something, in the case may be. And then look at how this might impact industry, of course, and the economy as a whole. So there are lots of explainer videos from the experts. Please check those out. I encourage you to do so. The links are in the slides that accompany this link, which you can find on Canvas in modules. And from there, you can look at all of the expert videos that are out there from sources like ACDC Econ and You're Gonna Love Economics and Jason Welker and Welkernomics and that sort of thing. But today we're going to cover Chapter 19, looking at efficiency and particularly different market outcomes that are efficient and inefficient. And we start off with the basics, always focused on food because there's nothing better than pizza, right? And so when we look at pizza and trying to decide how many slices do we eat, we always look at equilibrium. We look at supply and demand. We measure the marginal cost, which is our supply curve. We measure the marginal benefit, which is our demand, what we're getting out of it, and what we want as a result. And we know that if we select a number of slices that is too low, then we're still going to be hungry. We're still going to be hungry. The marginal benefit is definitely there and greater, but the cost hasn't caught up yet. If we select too many slices of pizza, we're going to be too full. We're going to be nauseous. We might have indigestion, maybe heartburn. So what we're looking for is equilibrium. We're looking to find that sweet spot at which supply meets demand, marginal cost meets marginal benefit. Just like we've talked about the entire semester, looking at where is the sweet spot. And this, mind you, also includes no deadweight loss because there's no shortages, there's no surpluses, there's no extras. We've utilized all of our resources productively and allocatively efficient in this regard. So when we apply it to free markets, as we've done over the course of this semester, we look at what we call the invisible hand, the idea that society is moving in the direction of those that most benefit society. So when there is an incentive for people to get a marginal benefit out of something, they're more willing to forego the marginal cost. And so that MC equals MB is what we're looking at always. Now we know people respond to incentives, so do businesses, and that is no truer than what we're going to talk about today when it comes to externalities. But businesses are incentivized. Their profit is their incentive. And so just like consumers are looking at low prices and looking at quality products in order to buy, they want to come back and vote with their dollars by buying more of those types of things. It's the invisible hand at work in the marketplace. And government doesn't need to step in these situations because the invisible hand takes care of those markets. The markets are taking care of themselves. And that's always a wonderful thing when the supply and demand meets at equilibrium. There's no deadweight loss. There's no extra. There's no shortages. No surpluses. And we meet it at equilibrium. It's a wonderfully great system of the invisible hand in free markets. But the question is, does it ever fail to meet society's needs? And the answer is yes. There are times in which there is market failure. We've looked at several from the time when we were determining the quantity controls on taxi cab medallions to the labor market and hiring too many or too few people. There are market failures that do occur. And so this is when the invisible hand isn't working or it isn't working as effectively as it could be. And so the government may need to be called upon in order to step in to help the situation because of the market failure. And that's really what this chapter is about, is when government steps in, and we've seen government step in before, that didn't work out so well. Price controls, when we have price ceilings and price floors. We know that there are shortages, there are surpluses, all of those things bringing about some type of market failure where not everybody is getting what everybody wants in the marketplace. But the idea here is we're trying to right the wrongs of misallocation so that everyone can get their fair share in the marketplace. And so some of the market failures that we see are around public goods, particularly when public goods are provided in a market because private industry doesn't see value or profit in doing so. We see that in a lot of different in a lot of different aspects. Externalities is what we're going to talk about today. We saw this with monopolies and imperfect competition, and natural monopolies that government basically sets up because they're imperfectly competitive, because there is a reason for them to take advantage of economies of scale and bring down those costs so that they can pass along those cost savings to their customers, to the consumers. And then the last thing we'll talk about, which ties in more to chapter 20, but looking at the unequal distribution of income and this idea of the Lorenz curve, which is more of what we'll talk about in chapter 20. But we'll get a kind of a precursor to it here in chapter 19. So we know that up to this point we've had marginal benefit equals marginal cost, supply meets demand at equilibrium, and everybody's happy. But we know that in social settings, when government needs to step in or needs to play a role, we look at what we call the marginal social benefit and the marginal social cost. And we're going to graph them in just a second. But it is important to know that just like our MB equals MC, now we're looking at the social aspects. So kind of the public aspects of these markets that are taking place. And we'll talk about a couple of examples here in just a second. But the MSB should be equal to the MSC. That is where we should produce, and that is where we're going to get the most benefit for society's sake. And that's the important piece here. So the whole idea is when we're looking at whether it's pizzas or aircraft carriers or swimming pools, we're looking at the marginal social benefit equal to the marginal social cost. So up to this point, we have talked about the pay schedule, demand and supply schedules. And in this case, we've got Adam and Jill that are willing to pay for a public park, a new park that the government is going to put in. And they're saying, how much am I willing to pay in taxes in order to get this park? Well, Adam is willing to pay $4 for the first park. And then you can see he's willing to pay $3 for the second, $2 for the third, and it goes subsequently down from there. All the way to $0, he is not willing to pay anything for the fifth park. So just like diminishing returns, we see that that's taking place here with Adam as well. It's also taking place with Jill. We have $5 she's willing to pay for one park, and then it subsequently goes down. She's still willing to pay for a fifth park, but not nearly as much as she was willing to pay for the first park. And so this tells us some information about what people are willing to pay in taxes in order to provide for some of these public goods that we see out there. So society's demand, or what we call the marginal social benefit, is adding up all of the willingness to pays. And in this case, for the first park, society is willing to pay $9. And so if we can get a park going for $9, and again, multiply that by the number of people that would be affected by this and willing to pay as part of this, that would kind of be your marginal social benefit. And you can see there the number of parks, by the time you get to the fifth park, society is not nearly as interested in paying for a fifth park as they were for the first park. So we're leaving out a very important aspect, which is how much does this cost? Well, if the marginal social cost of producing a new park is $5, then we're going to produce the number of parks where marginal social benefit equals marginal social cost. MSB equals MSC, what we talked about earlier. And again, this just goes back to our formula we've talked about all semester. MB equals MC, only in this case, it's society that is a part of it. So MSB equal to MSC. And in this case, the marginal social cost is $5. Society's benefit is $5 at 3 parks. So we will produce not 1, not 2, but 3 parks. And not 4 or 5, but 3 parks, because MSB equals MSC at that particular point. Now, what does it look like on a graph? When we look at the marginal social benefit to society, we can see that it is downward sloping, and we can see that the marginal social cost is going to be at $5, and I know the numbers are a little skewed on the left there, I apologize. But the idea here is we are going to produce the number of parks where MSB equals MSC, and that's going to be at 3 parks. We're going to be spending $5 to produce that, and society will benefit from these 3 parks, and everybody's happy. Okay. Now, what would happen if we were only to produce 1 park? Well, we can see here that society wanted more. They were willing to pay more. And so we're going to have a park that is very overrun. We're going to have a park that is very crowded. There's going to be a lot of people in there, and they're going to be demanding more parks. So you're not going to hear people saying how happy they are that the park is open. They're going to be complaining it's overcrowded already. You need to open another park. And that's the MSB equals MSC. In this case, if we were to open 4 parks, we would see the outcry of people having to spend so much money of their hard-earned money in taxes to pay for this additional park. And so there'd be a lot of complaints. Hey, this isn't worth the value that we thought it was. Why did you go to 4 parks? You're overextending yourself. You're spreading yourself too thin. We should have gone with 3 parks. And that's the point that they're trying to make, is we want to go back to this idea of MSB equals MSC. And that essentially is what we're talking about here when we're looking at the market outcomes, looking at MSB and MSC. Okay, so now let's look at externalities as we look at MSB equals MSC, and we've talked about that. Let's go back to externalities and define what that is, look at negative and positive externalities, and then how the Coase theorem has an impact. Remember, there are a lot of explainers to help in this regard, but let's dive right into the second part of this chapter. So externalities, when you hear that, you probably think of things like pollution, smog, water runoff, cleaning up a lake, for instance, because of all the trash, debris, and things that have plagued the area. And so a lot of times we're going to talk about negative externalities, what we call negative externalities, pollution being one of them. But we're also going to talk about the positive externalities. So let's look at what an externality is. Well, an externality is nothing more than a side effect. And that's basically either a benefit or a cost that is involved to people outside of those that made the decisions. So, for instance, we have less regulation. Less regulation leads business and industry to do what it wants, and unless someone steps in and says, "Hey, you need to put screens on those emitters, those smokestacks. Hey, you need to clean up what you're dumping here. Hey, you need to measure the air quality around you." All of those things are government driven, and if somebody isn't doing that, this is kind of what results, right? And when people aren't given trash receptacles or recycling receptacles or encouraged to put those things in places where they may be dumping trash, then they're just throwing it out. And if no one comes around to perform annual maintenance or cleanup, then this is the result of what we see. So it is definitely a side effect that affects a lot of other people than just the people who made the decision to step in or not step in. And this is a part of market failure. Externalities, those side effects, are very much a part of the market failure that we see or that we don't see taking place in the economy. And that's where government a lot of times does step in to try and right the wrongs, whether that is controlling pollution, trying to control a barking dog in the neighborhood. We hear a lot of homeowners associations that do that, trying to prevent the ills of smoking, or cleaning up an oil spill. All of these are negative externalities that impact society as a whole, and need some type of intervention by government, either in a large short-term commitment or smaller, but in the longer term, or some combination thereof. And again, how we weigh that depends on the circumstances, right? But it does create a lot of spillover into society and has significant impacts. So you can imagine if Zoram is a chemical company that pollutes the air when it produces its good, they're going to look at the internal costs. What does it cost us? But they're not going to pay attention to the social costs because society is not telling them that they have to. And if there's no regulation around them taking a look at that, then they're going to do what they need to do, and their costs are merely going to be what it's going to cost them to create these chemicals, to create these products. And so they're not going to look at the marginal social cost of the pollution that they're creating. And that really is where government plays a role in large amounts or small amounts, again depending on society and depending on the severity of the problem. But they're really doing it in order to try and limit their production, or getting them to think about what are the bigger picture issues, the marginal social costs of society. So how do we graph that? Well, we look at the marginal social benefit in terms of what a market, in this case it's cigarettes, what cost that has to society. And notice that the private cost is what we see there in the supply curve. Right? Now, that isn't the social cost, because the social cost is actually greater than the private cost. What it takes to actually make cigarettes is not what it actually costs society to handle the smoking of cigarettes. And that's the biggest difference here. The healthcare costs around society having to pay for someone who's going into the hospital for lung replacement surgery, and their healthcare, maybe they don't have healthcare, or maybe the healthcare they have doesn't cover the total costs and they don't have enough money to pay for it all, then society picks up the difference. And that's the social cost we're talking about here. So why is there a price per pack on cigarettes in terms of a cigarette tax? It's to bridge that private cost and social cost, bridging the difference between the two. Because of that overallocation. Society says, well, with the social cost, we should actually be producing less of this good. But because the free market has created more of the good, we have to bridge that gap by the overallocation. We have to bridge that gap by creating a tax that basically addresses it, a Pigouvian tax that essentially discourages people from smoking, and in order to bring that quantity back into line with what is optimal for society. So that's what we see here in terms of deadweight loss because of the overallocation. Okay, so the difference here is the marginal social cost, the marginal private cost, and then that per unit tax is going to bridge that solution between MSC and MPC. Okay, such that the per unit tax is going to eliminate deadweight loss because we're not producing at free market, we're producing at the optimal cost, because the number of people who are buying it with that additional cigarette tax has diminished, and it has brought the MSC back to, or excuse me, the MSB to the MSC. So here would be the optimal point at which we would be producing. Deadweight loss is eliminated because we're not producing at the quantity of the free market anymore. We're producing at the quantity of the social cost and social benefit that we see. And that leads us to the key graph 41. So anytime there is a negative externality, the amount of the Pigouvian tax, or the cigarette tax, the emissions tax, is essentially this gap that we see on Q1 from supply, the marginal private cost, to E1, or the price at P1, which is the marginal social cost. So notice the price is going up of the cigarettes. The price has gone up in order to account for the difference in what society is paying versus what it is costing private industry to produce those cigarettes. And so that's why we're producing at Q1, which is smaller. We're creating a price at P1 that is higher than at P, and that's the reasoning behind it, because of that difference between the marginal private cost, which you see here with supply, which is MPC, and the marginal social cost, what society is actually paying for those cigarettes. Okay, now we're going to switch gears and talk about the positive externalities. And we've seen a lot of them in the age of COVID with coronavirus. Vaccines is a great example of this, but there's also some other ones I want to talk about here that I think really demonstrate positive externalities. So let's talk about those for a second. What are they? Well, they're benefits. So if negative externalities were costs to society, then positive externalities are benefits to society. And what it is, in short, is just society is creating opportunities for the social benefit to be greater, and creating benefits to society as a whole as a result of government actions that they are taking. So government investing in flu vaccines, for instance, or COVID vaccines, or fill in the blank of any vaccine we're talking about here, polio or measles, mumps, rubella, the MMR. All of those vaccines were developed by private industry and paid for with a combination of private industry and government subsidies or other government programs. And the idea is to encourage development of vaccines that will save people's lives. And if people aren't sick and they're not in the hospital, then they're out working and they're contributing to society. They're helping to grow the economy as a whole. So everyone wins in that scenario. So that's why vaccines are a great example of a positive externality. But there are a couple of others that I want to mention here in terms of benefits that actually happened near my hometown in Indiana. This was an old Uniroyal tire plant that was downtown, right on the St. Joseph River. And in 1980, it had been sitting for probably a good 10, 15 years, just vacant and dilapidated and falling apart. And they dozed it. They basically blew it up and got rid of it. And they created, which was very popular at the time, they created subsidies to encourage businesses to move in to these areas, and they created a riverwalk. And a public-private partnership. They created a mixed-use development, which encouraged residential and business and some small industrial type of manufacturing or business to move in here, and created government grants or subsidies to encourage them to support this effort. And what you see here in 2020 is the result. When I came back to visit, one of the things that I noticed was that, wow, it was not the dilapidated old plant that we saw, 40, 50 years ago, but it was a brand new community in which people are moving into. They're living there, they're working there, they're contributing to the economy there, they're buying things there, they're encouraging other people to move into the area and also to live there, work there, and shop there and spend there, contributing to the local economy. So all of this is a positive externality. It's really encouraging that growth in the region, and by government stepping in and providing just a little bit of incentives to try and encourage people to move into the area, and I'm sure some tax breaks that go along with that, which added to that subsidy. But it encouraged the healthy growth of an economy that was clearly not there back in the 70s and the turn of the 1980s. And so that is what we see is a great example of a positive externality. Now let's graph it out. So what we see here is a marginal private benefit and a marginal social cost. Now notice the social benefit isn't here yet. And the reason for that is because we're going to create a subsidy to encourage the development of flu shots by private industry, by companies, pharmaceutical companies, and other manufacturers to develop these flu shots. And a lot of times they get, some level of patent exclusivity for a while before it goes generic in order to take advantage of those types of situations to encourage that development of new vaccines. And so what we see is a Pigouvian subsidy that is basically creating a greater marginal social benefit. So the difference here is, notice the quantity of the free market was here at QFM. The quantity with this subsidy is creating an optimal quantity that is greater. So we're creating more development of more vaccines, more flu shots, and more for people to go in people's arms in order to encourage their health and wellness. And so it is creating a marginal social benefit that shifts rightward outward and moves supply along the curve to a greater quantity at a higher price point. But the difference is this Pigouvian subsidy is paying for the benefits. So while society, as part of government, is paying for that, it is really the subsidy that is bridging that gap. So if you really look honestly at the amount of quantity that's being developed, it is the society individually as a consumer, or your health insurance is paying a smaller price because the subsidy is bridging that gap because of the government subsidies in that positive externality. And so that's what we see creating that marginal social benefit that we see here in this slide. So if we produce at the free market, it would be a market failure because clearly we can see we should be producing more. It's not an over-allocation, it's an under-allocation in this case because we're not producing what we could be producing. And when too little is produced, we're not living up to our full potential. As we know from previous graphs and conversations. And so it creates a deadweight loss. It creates the triangle here, the deadweight loss of an underallocation at which we could be producing more and we're not. And so that's the unfortunate part. And so with the subsidy, we are creating an optimal quantity that is greater, and we are helping people live longer and be healthier, and we're doing that at a price point that is actually less for the consumer, greater for society as a whole, but the benefit is greater too. And that's the difference that we see here. So deadweight loss created if we created a quantity at the free market. But with that government subsidy, we're actually encouraging that growth. We're encouraging that health and wellness. We're encouraging those positive developments and the positive externalities or benefits or side effects that we see in society today. And that leads us to key graph 42. So notice here, we have the demand, which is a marginal private benefit. Everything is at P1 and Q1. That is the equilibrium at E1. And notice that if we create a Pigouvian subsidy, which is just a fancy way for the economist Pigouvius, that is essentially creating a Pigouvian subsidy to create the marginal social benefit. Yes, the price is higher, but what a consumer actually pays is P2. What society pays is from P2 to P3. So actually everyone is benefiting as a result of this externality, of this benefit, of this flu shot or vaccine or whatever it is. And that is significant because it is helping to create a healthier society. For COVID, if you remember, the vaccines allowed us to go back out into the workplace and go back to movie theaters and go back to vacations and cruises and in hotels, and we were all homebound until the vaccine came out, and then all of a sudden everybody was able to resume normal operations once again. So that's the significance of a positive externality. All right, so here's some questions. You can pause the video here in terms of trying to answer them, trying to ask them and answer them. I want to move on and talk about the tragedy of the commons. So let's take a look at this last section of chapter 19, which is the tragedy of the commons. And this is looking at pollution, one of those negative externalities, once again, we come back to, and the economics of pollution. Why is it that government needs to step in some of these scenarios? So the common pool problem is the one I'm going to use here because I think it is so significant in addressing the tragedy of the commons. And basically it just means what we're envisioning there, the common pool problem. We have a public pool and everybody uses it, right? And you can insert beach or you can insert, whatever here. But the idea is everybody is using it. And as it gets overrun with people and nobody's cleaning it up and everybody is using it and using up the good clean water, what we're left with is the tragedy of the commons. We're left with the trash. We're left with the debris. We're left with the kind of leftover human societal externalities that we really don't want to take place. And so this is where government needs to step in and in order to try and find that balance. Now, there sometimes, as we know, government can overreach. So that finding that fine line is a really good way to meet that MSB equals MSC, the marginal social benefit equal the marginal social cost. And where do we find that? There's no easy science to it. This is why when government puts in new roads, when they're looking at new highways or talking about expanding the Beltway, for instance, they're looking at environmental impact studies. Why? Because of this exactly, this marginal social cost, marginal social benefit. They're looking at, we don't want to use this to create a positive externality, only to create an even bigger negative externality. So where do we weigh the costs and benefits in order to make those decisions? We conduct a study, and those studies tell us where is the appropriate time and place and the appropriate amount to be able to carry that out, so that we don't end up with the common pool problem. Now, government's been doing this for quite a while, and economists have been paying attention because obviously in the free markets, people act in their own self-interest, as do companies. And if government doesn't step in, you continue to have the same issues of companies and consumers acting in their own self-interest. So this is where government needs to come in and say how much is too much, how little is too little, where can we find that balance, and that's government's job, is to figure that out. A great example of this is the acid rain that we saw in the early 90s. It was pretty significant, and particularly in the East Coast, in which this, and again, I'm not a science teacher, so bear with me here, but you can see acid rain having a significant impact on the eastern half of the United States for the most part. And so what government did was government established a lot of regulations through the EPA and through other environmental standards and regulations, and they imposed significant cutbacks on pollutants, on the hydrogen ions that were in the air, and a lot of those pollutants, like those smokestacks we saw before. And what happened as a result? Well, we fast forward 15 years later to look at the same study being done just 15 years later, 16 years later, and we can see that has had a significant difference. It's had a significant impact. Now technology has also helped to allow that type of change to take place, which I'm sure wasn't there if you look back into the 80s and 90s. But it is significant in that it does underscore the point that government stepping in to regulate and finding the right amount of regulation really can help and provide a positive externality to the regulations that are taking place and that they're trying to implement and trying to address. All right, so that wraps up Chapter 19, believe it or not. Here is a list of key terms. I would encourage you to check out the take-home packet and the key questions associated with it. Hopefully, this video will help to address a lot of those in terms of what we see here. And again, Pigouvian taxes, emissions taxes, very similar to those. I think that was probably about the only thing that we didn't really address there. And the idea of the Coase theorem, trying to encourage some type of regulation in order to get government to encourage or discourage people or businesses or both to do the right thing in order to help society as a whole. Here are the answers to the take-home packet. You can pause this in order to use those. Those are also in the slides, okay? So I hope you found this helpful in Chapter 19 and in this overview video of Chapter 19. And stay tuned for the next video, which will look at Chapter 20 on different types of goods. A very important one as we close out AP Microeconomics. Thanks for staying with me. Live that 5. #Econ is life.